Check, check. All right, so today, kind of our last pipeline class, I guess you could say. There's a couple other things that I want to sprinkle in, compositing-wise, throughout the remaining classes, but it's really about time after today's class that we switch gears towards the final project, right? So today, we're going to look at composure again. We're going to talk about putting shadows in composure and the process for doing that. And then we're going to look at the process for exporting your foreground and background elements from a composure. Composure is, I don't think it's officially in beta anymore. I think it's version 1, but it's still a pretty quirky plugin for Unreal. And also with the release of Unreal Engine 5 a couple months ago, there's a little bit of disconnect between some of the features in Unreal Engine 5 and what is currently available in Composure. I'm hoping as an artist myself that uses these tools that Epic starts to support these compositing tools a little bit more, and I think they are. That's the direction that the industry is moving. But the point is that there may be some workflows that we're doing in this class that are changing or modifying depending on new releases with the Unreal Engine. We're in kind of a weird in-between right now. So today I'm going to show you kind of an older way to export composure files, which is pretty simple and straightforward. And then in a future class, we'll look at the more current media render queue way to do things with fancy stencil layers and stuff like that. Full disclosure, the media render queue, if you know what that is in Unreal, that's the current way that we render stuff out. We've used it in class before, in early weeks. It doesn't really play very nice with Composure. Google it. There are people asking, when's this going to work with media render queue? You can get it to work with some work, but it's not a painless thing, and that's kind of annoying. So the pipeline that we look at for today will allow us to finish out this class, but moving forward into the future, it's not necessarily the most efficient way or the most advanced way technically. But I'm hoping to talk about those things a little bit more in the future. So with that being said, any just absolutely devastating composure problems pop up that we can solve without sitting down for 20 minutes? Anybody want to bring anything up? Yeah?
I don't know if this can be solved in under 20 minutes, but when I brought my stuff in from C4D into the project, the timing of the keyframes was off.
Mm-hmm.
It was shorter than the length of it. So I found the workaround for proportional stretching, but just wondering if there's
C4D, After Effects to C4D to Unreal. Yeah, that's strange. Unless you have your default settings for cinema to a different frame rate or something like that, but I wouldn't think that would be something that you would have. This is an obvious problem with Maya. I've talked about that problem before. Maya's default frame rate, I think Blender's default frame rate is 24 frames a second. So that would be my first inclination, would be Cinema 4D is the culprit. But then again, that didn't happen for us. So I don't know. And maybe go back and check at Cinema and just see how many frames rendered out. And if it's less than from After Effects, then it's definitely a Cinema problem. Unreal is not converting anything. It's just ingesting whatever you feed it. So the problem had to have happened with Cinema. That's my guess. Did you have the problem with Blender?
Yeah. Plus the Blender default frame is 24, and AE they just each time I open up my file, it just varies different times. Sometimes 24, sometimes 60, and I just have to get a new AE file and set the frames before I actually open the video. So,
right.
Yeah, set up to 24, all of them are 24, and finally I fix that problem.
Right. Yeah, you got to be really aware of that, especially if we're converting things to image sequences. If you're shooting video that has a specific frame rate, when you convert it to an image sequence, you want to make sure that you're maintaining that frame rate and not changing anything. I guess that's that's not so much of a problem because you haven't tracked it yet. But as we saw, using a video and then using an image sequence, there were different frame rates, something you wouldn't notice unless you went looking for it. It's a really easy problem to have and frustrating when you can't figure it out. I think I told the story before in this class. Our old pipeline was with Maya, and Maya's default frame rate was 24. And when I was trying to develop this pipeline, I couldn't figure out what the hell the problem was, and it was freaking me out. I would bring it into Unreal, and it would start out good, and then all of a sudden everything would drift, and it would get worse and worse and worse and worse. It's obviously a frame rate problem, but I didn't know why. I checked all my boxes, I dotted all my I's, and yeah, it was just I found one obscure person on the internet talking about, not related to Unreal at all, but they were talking about something else, and they're like, "Oh yeah, Maya's default frame rate 24 frames a second." Oh, okay. But then it also had to be set in a very particular way, like before, at least with Maya, we're getting a little off track here, but before I even imported the camera from After Effects, I would have to set the frame rate first, because if I set the frame rate after I imported it, it wouldn't work. So it was like all these weird steps that had to be done in a certain order. It was really annoying. So I feel your pain on that. Any other trials and tribulations? Yeah?
Yeah, I'm just wondering all of my objects are transparent. I don't know why. And I look up for the documentations is that I have to change the render settings. And after I change my render settings and restart my UI, and it just the whole file I can't open it anymore. Yeah, it just stopped at loading 45, and I just can't open my file anymore.
Well, you just got to wait longer. Obviously.
I also had a similar issue where the compositing is transparent. I wrote about it in my blog post, but did you see what zoom capture setting is that?
I look up for the documentations that I have to change the render settings.
It's that, and then for me, my issue was the CG element was you're rendering it with RGB with the opacity at A, but if you set it to final color, it composites properly. If you see it in my I took 2 screenshots of what you have to do to get it to work.
But that doesn't solve the crashing issue, right?
Yeah, that's why.
My is cracked.
So a couple people had that problem, and I think a few of them solved it by making sure that this was checked. But that seems to have introduced the crashing problem, right? So I don't know for sure because I'm not working on your machines, but I think that might have to be doing with like the DirectX settings. So you could try changing your default RHI from DirectX 12 to 11. Try it. That could possibly work. I'm not going to do that now because it's going to compile for 5,000 years. But who was it that had changed the RHI? So yours was crashing or frozen until you changed it?
Yeah.
Okay. And you changed it from 12 to 11?
Yeah.
Okay. Worth a shot. I've never had that problem before with Composure, but I remember I would have that problem when trying to use ray tracing with Unreal Engine 4. You have to change it to DirectX 12. It would take forever to load. It'd be stuck at 45% for what seemed like.
Yeah, 45% stuck for forever.
Yeah.
Just waiting, and I just don't open my file.
Yeah. Well, if you change the RHI, it'll probably be stuck again for a while. But just go have a snack, watch a movie, come back.
Thank you.
Anybody else? We have so much pipeline now. There is lots and lots of chances for failure because there's so many different moving pieces. And as we start bringing in assets from other places and animations, it's gonna be a big, beautiful mess. Nothing else? Okay. So just to go over the flow of things here. So like I said, today's kind of the last necessary pipeline class. We're going to have another class on rendering, or not the entire class, but kind of just like a half class while we're workshopping on more advanced techniques, but that's not really crucial to this class. After today, you will have learned pretty much everything that you need to do to achieve the final project, minus the creative, I suppose, which is the most important part. Cool, you can put a box on Unreal. Final project, beautiful. It'd be funny if I got 10 final projects that were just this. Very impressive. So next week, we're going to talk about making proposals, treatments, and previs techniques, strategies for doing previs in the pre-production phase of your project. I know we don't have a ton of time to spend on our projects. We have about a month. In the middle of that is Thanksgiving break, so we don't have a ton of time. But we'll talk about the pre-production process, previs, blocking out our worlds, how to develop a world, how to build up an idea from scratch, how to pitch an idea, how to sell an idea to clients, that sort of stuff. I'll show you a bunch of examples of my own that I can talk about trials and tribulations that happened with that, successful projects, dead projects, that sort of stuff. And in the second half of class next week, there's been some rumblings, people asking, like, when are we going to make groups? What are the groups? What are the groups? I don't make the groups. The groups are determined by you. So if that is something that you're actively forming now, that's absolutely fine. Next week's class, we will designate time to have a little quick speed dating session to put everybody that's not already in a group. Because the week after that, on the 10th, you will be presenting proposals. So you have 1 week to turn around a proposal. Okay? Quick turnaround. And then we have about a month to work on the project, which is more than enough time to make something amazing. Complete faith in you. I've made tons of amazing things in a month. And then any class after that, we'll talk about version control a little bit and some filler things that aren't crucial but are good to know depending on how things go. It's kind of open-ended in a sense that depending on how much support y'all need technically on things. Things have been going pretty well so far, I think. I will say, just looking at the blogs, thank you for being so up to date on them. I will say that the problems that I'm seeing, I think, stem a lot from just footage that's not tracking very well in the beginning for some of you. So again, it's not, a lot of times it's just your footage is not cooperating with you. And if that's the case, you need to cut it loose and do something else or rethink it or talk to me about using, a more powerful tracker. You know what? Remind me to post the link to Buju so y'all can use it. I said I was going to do that last week. But I think a lot of the problems that I'm seeing with this is not everybody, but there's some of you that are going through the whole pipeline still and things are just kind of floating around and they're not really locked to the surface. And that's just not a good track. That's the whole thing. It's not Cinema 4D. It's not Unreal. It's not Composure. It's not you. It's your footage. Okay. Any questions about moving forward? All right. Are you ready for me to hit you in the face again with composure? But shadows this time. Composure, but darker now, because we're in shadow. All right. These slides are also on the drive, as they always have been. So we've already set up composure. We've already done all that. And as we saw last week, it worked. And as you saw in most of your assignments, it worked. So great job if you got through the entire thing and you posted your assignment. That's not a small thing to do. You went through this whole big-ass pipeline. Good job. This is the third iteration of this class, and it gets better every time. The first time was completely remote, so that was almost like a complete failure. The second time last year, it was like half and half. Some people use composure, others just kind of put planes in the world. We definitely were not as advanced as a class at that point. Much few people had 3D experience. This class, though, rock and roll. You guys are good. Most of you. So our goal today is to put the shadow underneath the thing, right? So in this example here, this is something from Maya here. And video footage of this street. Obviously, the text shadow is CG. And the text shadow is casting a shadow on the street. So the way that is happening is there's actually a plane, the grid that we've done our track with. The grid is actually aligned with the street, right? And then there is a surface, there's a plane there that is laying on the street that is catching that shadow from that CG element, from the text that's 3D. Then that plane is invisible, right? It's only showing the shadow. If you're familiar with After Effects, you may know if you use like lighting and stuff in After Effects, you can set certain layers to be shadow only. Similar sort of idea. In 3D softwares, you can do this in the material where you tell an object that it only will retain shadow information. It won't display anything else. It won't display any other RGB information, just the shadow. It only catches the shadow, which is why it's called a shadow catcher. Now, for the folks that are thinking about doing projects on green screen, red X, you can't really do this because you don't have a street to cast a shadow on, right? You're getting rid of the street because you're cutting it out, right? Only your subject is being retained on the green screen. So this pipeline here is much more so for on location footage like this. If you're using green screen, you can have you can have your video footage in Unreal cast a shadow. You can have your media plates cast a shadow in Unreal, just like any object. The downside of something like that is that it's a 2D shadow. So if the light is shining directly at video footage of me right here, and it's shining right at me, I'm going to cast a shadow that looks pretty good behind me, right? The silhouette's going to look pretty good. If that light moves over here, shadows over here still looks pretty good. If that light goes over here, well, then it's just casting like a line because I'm just a flat surface, right? That starts to fall apart. So if you have lighting that is aggressive like that and reveals the magic trick, it doesn't look so good. Is that a big deal to you? I guess that depends on your taste and your goals and your aesthetic and et cetera, et cetera. But what we're doing today with the shadow catcher is not really a green screen thing. Just full disclosure on that. I'm going to put you all on the spot real quick. Who would say, I know maybe there's some groups, maybe not, but as individuals right now, who's more interested in the green screen approach, shooting somebody on green screen, putting them into a world versus shooting something in the real world and putting CG into it? Who's more interested in the green screen approach, would you say? Who's more interested in the real world approach? About half and half. Cool. It reminds me today, and I'll show you shadow tricks for green screen. But let's do the shadow catchers first. All right, so first things first, setting up a shadow catcher in Composure. So this assumes that you've gone through the whole Composure setup already, right? Everything looks good already. Your CG elements are all lined up on your footage. It all tracks. Everything looks great. First thing we need to do is create an artificial floor for our shadows to cast onto. That can be a three-dimensional object. It can be a plane. It doesn't really matter what it is. It just has to be aligned to the grid, 0. Okay? So like in this case here, you can see the checkerboard floor is the floor of the tables and chairs. And look at the shadow that is casting from the table and chairs onto the gridded surface of the floor, right? So on the video footage here, you can see there's no shadow yet. Our goal is to make a shadow there. But it's a little bit of a setup. It's a kind of a convoluted setup as well. Although if you understand render pipelines, it might make a little bit more sense to you. So first step, make a floor. Second step, we need to make a layer for that floor. We've made layers last week for class. Make a layer for the floor, call it floor, doesn't really matter what it's called, put the floor in it. And then add that to your CG element so that you have not only the CG elements like the tables and chairs, but you also have the floor included. Prior to this, there was no floor in it. We just added the floor. But we didn't add the floor to the furniture layer. We added the floor to its own layer. That's going to be important later. And then down here, see, we're adding a new capture actor for the floor layer. Next thing we need to do is we need to make that pretty checkerboard floor white. What we're ultimately doing here is we're isolating the shadow. This is a little bit of a hacky way to isolate the shadow. Shadows are black, right? We are casting a shadow onto a white surface. White and black are mattes. So that's going to allow us to isolate the shadow and ultimately put it on our background footage. So we need to make a material for the floor. It's the most simple material in the world. Plug a 1 into your base color. Put it on the floor. Now you have a white floor. Now we need to create a sky. It doesn't particularly matter that it's a sky so much that it just fills up the rest of the viewport, right? Because we want to have all of the screen except for the shadow be white. So we need to block out our sky. The easiest way to do this would be to add a sphere to your level. Add a sphere to your level. Makes sense to make it 0, 0, 0. Put it right in the middle of your world. Make it big so it encompasses your entire scene. Probably 1,000 or something. It really depends on how big your scene is, how big your world is. Pro tip here that's really important. When we do this, you'll see, make sure to turn off cast shadows. You went through, you put all your lighting on your world, you're all happy with how it looks, and then you just went and you dumped a big fat sphere on top of your world. Now all your lighting is gone. Why? Because the sun is shining on the outside of your sphere and it can't get in, right? So if we turn off cast shadows on the sphere, then the sphere itself is no longer going to be casting shadows on our world, and that will let the sunlight through. Really easy problem to forget. It will probably happen to a couple of you. And then we need to make a material for the sky. This one can be an emissive material. Also very simple. An emissive 1 for white. Also make this unlit. And then also make this two-sided. Why can the sky be emissive and unlit but not the floor? Where are the shadows falling? on the floor. If the floor was an unlit material, there would be no shadows on it, right? Because the floor would be like a light bulb. You can't put shadows on a light bulb, right? That's why. Another good thing, forgot, your floor should be big enough to encompass the fall off of your shadows, right? If you have something really tall in your world that's casting a really long shadow from a really low light in the evening or something, you're casting a really long shadow, you don't want that shadow to, let's see if I can draw this here. You don't want that shadow to stretch out over the edge of this, right? I can't zoom in and draw at the same time. But if your shadow clips off the edge of the plane, well, then it's going to be a hard edge to it, right? So you want that surface to be as big as your shadows are going to be. Can it be too big? No, not really. I mean, it just needs to be big enough to encompass all the area. I guess it could clip through your sphere for your sky if you really wanted it to. I don't know if you get any sort of weird graphical glitching or anything. But point is, just make it big enough. Okay, then drag that material onto the sky. So the sky is unlit. And then also we need to create a layer for the sky, just like we did for the floor. This layer for the sky and the floor, only the sky and the floor live in those layers. Okay? And then in this example, furniture layer has all the furniture. And then we're also adding the sky to our CG element. So before last week, we only had one capture actor here for our foreground. Now we're adding the floor and the sky. And once you do that, depending on your lighting situation, you'll start to see something that looks like this, which I think you can start to imagine how this is going to work as a matte. Now, you may see like vignetting here on the edge. That could be a problem, depending on how your assets are working out. And what you can do to fix that is mess around with a post-processing value. You can add a post-processing value to your level and adjust the max and minimum exposure settings, and also turn off the bloom. That will help with that. And that should help white everything out, because that's the ultimate goal. We don't want it to look like this. We want it to look like white with a shadow. Ideally without any sort of fall-off vignetting here. Also, that is going to be controlled by the power of your skylight and the power of your other lights in your scene, like your directional light. It's a little bit of a balancing act. And remember, we can darken our shadow in post. So if you have to wash out your shadow a little bit in composure, it's going to be okay, because you can always, it's more just about getting the matte for the shadow than it is actually dialing in the look of it, if that makes sense. So now this is where things get a little bit tricky. So now that CG element that we had, I think we called ours foreground last week. In this example here in the slides, they call it CG element, or I called it CG element because I made this. Now we need to duplicate that. And we're going to have one that is called shadows. The name is arbitrary, but it makes sense for what they are. We're going to have one called shadows, and we're going to have one called no shadows. Okay? So if we click on one of them, it's going to be this right here. One is going to be all the actors and the shadows, and one is going to be all the actors with no shadows. And really, the only difference between these two is that one has the floor and the other doesn't have the floor. Because this one doesn't have the floor, it just has the white sky, which is emissive, so there's no shadows catching. And it's these two elements that we're going to divide mathematically in the material to separate out the shadow. And that's going to allow us to create a separate matte. So now I have shadow. This is harder to do with a trackpad. So now I have shadows and no shadows. And then you have to also remove the floor from the no shadow one. And we're almost done. We just need to create the material. This material here has the media. It has the two CG elements, the one with the shadows, the one without the shadows that are getting divided here. And then it has, this is called foreground. Actually, this is just no shadows back on top of itself again. And then there's a little bit of math going on here to separate out the shadow. That power parameter there is controlling the density of the shadow. You can also control that in post. And then we just have a couple overnodes here that are bringing all of that together. So all this stuff is creating the shadow, and then that foreground is getting put back on top of everything just to clean it up. And that's the material. And then the end result. This is a little bit of a harsh shadow because of the lighting, but that's the end result. Shadow over top of the video, just like here. And then once you have that shadow, you can take it into post, you can blur it, you can feather it, you can lighten it, you can darken it, you can change the color of it, you can mask it, you can do whatever you want to it. And we'll go through this as well. But when you export this, in this case, we have 3 plates that have been exported, or I guess 2 plates that have been exported. Then the media is just brought in as our original footage. So the media is our original footage, and we've exported the shadow, CG element, and the furniture. And then we just multiply the shadow into the video background. And that will knock out the white and lay it over top. Like this in After Effects. Piece of cake, right? So let's do it for real then. Any questions about that before we start? No? All right, so I'm just going to set up my composure real quick, and then we'll start from scratch. Layer comp, media plates, media, layer element, CG layer, foreground, add a table and chairs to the foreground. Also, another thing that some people had is composure doesn't really like the atmospheric fog and stuff, which is one reason to look into the Off-World Live pipeline for composure. It's a little bit more work than this, but it allows some things that composure out of the box doesn't. I'm hoping maybe that Epic buys what they're doing with Off-World Live, but we'll see. See if I get rid of the atmospheric fog, it takes that away. I don't really need atmospheric fog in this anyways, so I'm killing that. Okay, so we got our media. I need to set up the media. I have an existing media source in here that we've used a lot of times before. Good, good. Set the target camera. Got to set up the material. Oh my gosh, fastest composure setup you ever seen in your life, right? Look at that. A little misaligned, but that's all right. Why don't I just drag this into the foreground a little bit. Yeah, just like that. Cool. A little bit over so we can see our feet. Beautiful. All right. Well, here's where the fun stuff begins. So you feel good, you set up composure, you're happy with all this. Good, good. What's next? Well, you want to make a shadow. Now we'll say if for the green screen people, you don't have to make the shadow. You know, you can skip this part. And after we do the shadows in here, we're going to look at the rendering. If shadows are not, if you're not a fan of shadows, you don't need to do the shadow part to do the rendering part, is what I'm trying to say. All right, so first things first here. Let's add a floor. So I'm going to grab a plane. Also remember, you can't drag stuff into the CG elements. Happens to me sometimes, like, why the hell will this not drag into the world? Well, it's because you put this here, dummy. You can only put it here. Drag this out of the way. Center this. And blow this up a bit. This flickering that happens, it's because you have meshes occupying the exact same place in space. So if that's a problem, get rid of one. Here I have a couple. It looks like I had a floor in here, the default floor. What's that at? It's the default floor. Yeah. I can kill the default floor. And it looks like I have that solid from way back when we were in After Effects. Seems like it's been a long time. Cool. Now I have a surface for my shadows to fall on. Cool, cool. So now we need to create a layer. So here I have a table and chairs layer that I can click on and off. That's been assigned to the foreground element already, right down here, table and chairs. Now I'm going to create a new one. Select the floor first. I'm going to rename this to floor. Right click in the layers, add selected actor to new layer. Also call this floor. And then I want to add this to my CG element. So remember, we don't want to add the floor to the table and chairs because in the end we're going to want to separate these things out. So you might think, I'll be efficient. I'll just put the floor in the same layer. Don't do that. So down here we're going to need to add another capture actor. See, it says capture actors right there, one array element. We want to click that plus circle. So it makes another one. And we want to click on the next index number. And we want to include actor set none right now. We're going to click the drop down there and find floor. Floor. Scrub through this a little bit. Oh, we can see the sky a little bit. Okay. You know what, I'm just going to shrink down my floor a little bit in size so you can see the difference when we bring in the sky. And my shadows don't fall over the edge, so that's good. All right, we need a material now. Create a new material, call this floor. very imaginative in my names. Right click, constant of 1, 0 is black, 1 is white. Drag this into base color. Save that. And then I will drop that on the floor. I guess the material that was on there by default was kind of white already. Now we made sure of it though. Next thing, let's go grab a sphere. So in the place actors, I'm going to shapes and then just getting the default sphere. There are, if you have a sphere that's already had its normals turned inside out, you could use that if you really wanted to. In this case, we're using a sphere and we're just going to put a two-sided material on it. That's also a very important thing, right? Because if you look at this sphere right now, it looks lovely, right? But as soon as I blow this up, oops, wrong keyboard. As soon as I blow this thing up, well, now it's not white anymore because we're inside of it, because it only has a single-sided material on it. So I'm going to center this sphere, and then I'm going to blow it up, 1,000 or something. And we're in the sphere, yet I can't see the sphere. But I can see the shadow casting from the sphere, right? So a couple things. We need to create the material for the sphere first. So I'm going to create a material, _sky, go into the sky, make a new constant. Pro tip for making constants, keyboard shortcut 1. For some reason that's not working. Never mind, not pro tip. It's supposed to be 1 left click. This time we don't want this to be base color, we want this to be emissive color. Also 1, so that it's white. And then we want this to be unlit. So shading model, unlit. Shading model, unlit. So I go and do that, and it doesn't look like anything's really changed because we're still inside the sphere. Common mistake, you got to remember to set this to two-sided because we're inside the sphere, right? Go ahead and save it now that it's two-sided. And we still don't see anything. Uh-oh. Is my sphere bigger than my skybox? No. Oh, it's because I didn't put the material on the sphere. Also very important. Put the material on the sphere then, that you just made. Spent all that time making the material, didn't even put it on the thing it needed to go on. So now it's a white sky. You see we're still casting shadows, right? So I need to go into, I'm going to rename the sphere to sky so it's more memorable. Need to go into the sky, and I need to go into the details for that sky and find shadow. Cast shadow. Cast shadow is currently on. So we want to turn that baby off. Starting to white out, right? Look at that. There's still a little bit of a seam here. That's all right. We'll work with that. So we added the materials to the floor. We added it to the sky. Now we need to assign that sky to a layer and assign that sky to a CG element. So I'm going to select the sky, right click in my layers, add selected actors to new layer, call this sky. Now the sky's on a layer. Cool, cool. So now you take a look and see if they are matted out. Still a little bit of a seam of white. We have a couple different settings that we can play around with to mess with that. But no, we'll just look at the post-processing volume now, I suppose. So in-place actors, I don't know if you've ever messed around much with post-processing in Unreal. Post-processing in Unreal is a very powerful thing. That's what gives you the extra secret sauce that makes everything look really unreal in Unreal. Without post-processing, you don't get that extra color grading or that really sexy bloom or motion blur or any of that sort of stuff. All that stuff is inside of a post-processing volume. So in the Place Actors tab, I'm just going to type post for post-processing. I'm going to drag one of these guys into my level. And you see it exists as a volume. Yeah, anything inside of it gets the settings that are determined over here in the details. In order to have it affect everything, you don't have to scale it to affect your entire world. There's a really easy setting down here. If you select your post-processing volume and you scroll down, 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 you see a checkbox here called Unbound, Infinite Extent. That just basically means affect everything. So check that. And there's some settings that we can play around with here, like exposure. By default in Unreal, you have auto exposure on. It's like auto eye adaptation. It's like when you go and watch a movie in a movie theater and then you come outside and it's 1 o'clock in the afternoon. You're like, oh, my eyes. It takes a second for your eyes to adapt. By default, that's on in Unreal because it's realistic. With compositing, we don't like realistic things, so we turn those things off. Or we turn that off so we have more control. But we can mess around with the max and minimum settings here to brighten things up. You see it brightened up a little bit there. Is that enough? Do we need to go more? We will revisit these settings. But the point is right now is that I use the post-processing to white things out. Now, here's another thought. The settings that we're using right now, the lighting settings that we're using right now to separate out the shadow, we don't have to use those lighting settings to render out the actual content, right? We could go through this whole process, white out the background, make sure it doesn't have any bleed. Yeah, washed out my table and chairs a little bit, but this is all serving a point that allows me to get my shadow out, right? Then after that, or I guess before that too, I could have rendered out how I like my actual content to look, how I like the table and chairs with the lighting that they have, ignoring the shadow, okay? So you can render this in multiple passes because they're going to be separated out. The shadow itself is going to live as a separate image sequence. On top of that, we're going to lay the original graphics on top of it. So to our end right now, we're adjusting the lighting to make the shadow most conducive for compositing, is what I'm trying to say. I'm going to kill this cube. Sorry, cube. Cool. All right, so the post-processing is looking good. We're all whited out. What next? We added the sky. I didn't add the sky to, no, I did not add the sky to the foreground yet. As you can see here, there's no sky, just a floor. So I'm going to go ahead and click on my foreground CG element, and I'm going to add another capture actor. Click on that other index, click on the drop down for none, and click on sky. So now I have 3 capture actors here. The table and chairs on a layer by themselves, the floor on a layer by itself, and the sky on a layer by itself. And that looks like it should. It has the sky, it has the floor, it has the table and chairs. So we've set up all the elements in the background now, or in the world, I should say. Now we have to duplicate our CG elements, and we're going to rename them a little bit to stay organized. So I'm going to click on the only CG element that I have here, foreground. I'm going to duplicate this, and I'm going to rename one, shadow, and no shadow. Remember, the names that you use here is important for the names that you use in the compositing material. Also notice as soon as you do that, you will have broken the composite in the top level because we renamed them. And also we duplicated them. Okay, so we have a shadow capture actor. We want this to just be, we want this to be everything that we've done. The floor, the sky, the table and chairs, everything. This is the world with the shadow active. You see that they're the same thing right now because I just duplicated them. Click on no shadow. Let me pin this. Let me pin both of these. Click on no shadow, and all I got to do, it's really simple. After all this setup, it's really pretty simple. I just got to clear the floor, or tell it to exclude the floor. Instead of include, exclude floor. And look at that. One with shadow, one without shadow. Now, we need to go and fix this problem that the comp doesn't understand what we're trying to do anymore because we blew up the material. So I can go and make a new material. New compositing material. Composite with shadow. We want to drag that into the transform pass. This is the old one that we had in there. Remember, the old one was pretty simple, just this. Now we got to introduce all of the language for the shadow in here. So I'm going to drag this material on here, even though it's not set up yet. So it's ready to go. And I'm going to open this up. Now we got to start building our material. So I need a bunch of 2D textures here. 2D texture sampler parameter 2Ds. And I think this one is called media. I think one is called what, shadow, no shadow. We're eventually going to have one that's up top too. So this one is shadow. This one is no shadow. Okay, so we're going to take the shadows and we're going to divide them by the no shadows. Remember, we were using RGBA into divide. And then we're going to put this into a power node, which is like an exponent multiplier. Then we're going to put this into a saturate node, which will clean up the edges. And then we're going to put this into a multiply, which will allow us to lay it over top of the existing video footage. live in Unreal. And then we're going to have this all go into an over. The over is going to plug into, it's going to plug into emissive color. Remember, we need to make our materials for composure into post-processing materials in the material domain. And then we need to plug the media background into the B of the over so that the shadow and the furniture cover up the media. That'd be a little bit, oh, we need to create a scalar parameter. I'll just call this power as well. This is just a multiplier for the shadow. I'm just going to put this at a default of 1. Be a little organized here and call this shadow map. Pro tip, if you're trying to be more organized, you can double click on wires in Unreal and they will create these little nodes that just allow you to organize a little bit. Remember, the Q key allows you to straighten things. Because this really bugs me. If I select it and I hit Q, boom. Okay, that looks good. Looks good. Shadow matte. So the shadow and the no shadow dividing by each other, coming into power, currently at an exponent of 1. Saturate, multiplying. Oh, I need to, forgot to do that. What are we multiplying by? We need to multiply by the background. Okay. Multiplying by the background, and then all that is going into an over, which is laying that shadow on top of the original media. So we're going to get our shadow now. It's going to just be the shadow, and all of the actual furniture should look kind of dark and messed up too, because we haven't plugged in our foreground back on top of it. But I'll show you where we're at. So save. Fingers crossed. Oh, fingers crossed, check that out. Just our shadows. Who would have thought? Who would have thought this day would come? Get our shadows. Pretty neat, right? So for anybody that's familiar with rendering pipelines in like Cinema or Maya or Blender, and you've done shadow catchers before, this probably seems like a convoluted process, pretty tedious. But again, it's better than having to render for a full day. So I challenge you with that. So now we have our media, we have our shadow, and now I'm going to lay back over top the original table and chairs. So if what do I got? I got no shadow and shadow, right? So we're going to make another over here. And this is going to take everything that we've done with the shadows, and they're going to be in the B. Everything that we've done with the shadows Then it's going to take the original table and chairs and put them back over top. Jamming. No shadows. Oh, it's not no shadows, it's no shadow. Oops. I need to create. Forgot. We need to create a foreground that's just the table and chairs. So we're going to add another layer element, CG layer, foreground. Then I will add just the furniture to this one. Include furniture, so it's just the furniture by themselves. Table and chairs. Table and chairs by themselves. Let's call this foreground. That's what we're looking for. Dun 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 dun. Dun 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 dun. I feel like this is when Mario saves the princess, you know? Did it. Shadow on video in Unreal. Mission accomplished. Talk about a tedious ass process, huh? Whew. I didn't do that in my sleep now, though. And so will you. So, now that we have this all set up, one, you should feel pretty badass about yourself. And two, you can make any sort of adjustments that you need to with your lighting. Now, lighting-wise, you can run into problems, obviously, because if this light, well, one, the light that I have on the Unreal elements right now is not very realistic to the lighting of this scene. The actual lighting in this scene here is overcast day. There's not really any directional shadows. So I could try to recreate that. I'm not, because it's less obvious that the shadows are there, which is the point of this exercise, to show you how to create shadows. But you know, if you were, you could obviously try to move the shadows in a way that would look more realistic. You know, brightening up the skylight and doing a cube map instead, like the gray cube map that we did last week. And adjusting the intensity on that, but not too much. You need to play around with all these settings. But let's go back to the long shadows so I can make my point. So you may run into some problems if you have like a person standing here and you want to cast your shadows. Try to make a longer shadow here. Come on. This setting just keeps wanting to jump. You know, what if I cast my shadow through her, right? Like that. I don't know if you can tell, but it's on her leg. And try to turn off, you see the shadows. You know, obviously that doesn't really make sense. the shadow looks right now like it's just ignoring that she is a vertical being in this world, right? Where the shadow should clip into her at a different angle. Those sorts of problems are things that you're just going to have to fake in post-production. There's not really any like surefire way to do something like that. What you could try to do, some things that I've done in the past is that, not for this, but if you have a little bit more foresight and your entire project hinges on like accurate real world shadows, you could try to have like a 3D placeholder in there, which could go as crazy as meaning an actual like motion captured 3D placeholder in there. So she doesn't move around a lot. So you almost could get around with just put like a cylinder there on where her leg is. So you're just casting a shadow at that angle that is vaguely in the position of her leg. This becomes really difficult if she's dancing around, right? In that case, I don't know, maybe then you need to actually like rotoscope out a 3D model and animate it in the position of that body to get an accurate shadow. It's crazy. You only would need to do that wherever the shadow is touching the body. If the shadow is only touching the legs, you only need to do that on the legs, not on the top necessarily. But in this case, since she's not moving a lot, it's actually pretty easy. Honestly, you just do it in After Effects with a mask because she's not moving very much. But for your case, I don't know, it might be more of a problem. So I just want to flag that as a potential issue. How do we, what's another way that we solve this issue? Point your shadows the other way, right? The light's coming from that way now. Problem solved. Similar sort of thing with, and things in the environment. This ground here is fairly flat. I know it has, ups and downs with the dirt. So the shadow shouldn't be perfectly flat. But is it really worth the effort to go in there and modify that? I don't know. That's really going to be determined by what your goals are. If, like this cement block wall here, if that was a lot higher, it would present a similar sort of problem. The shadow shouldn't be parallel to the same shadow that's on the ground. It should go and almost like cut through at a different plane. So you could try to recreate that with bricks in 3D and then composite it back onto the actual real world blocks. You could cover things up with actual CG, so it doesn't have to be composited. It's just a lot of different scenarios, and it really depends on what you're trying to do, I suppose. In this case, before, I had what was that called? Ground, I think. Static mesh. Is dragging these grounds into the world. Oh, again, don't drag it into your composite window. Drag this ground into my table and chairs layer. Similar sort of thing in this case. Do you want the table and chairs to look like they're nestled into the ground? And that seems more interesting and cooler, but you're going to need to play around and build the world to merge these two worlds together. This piece of ground has fairly obvious edges to it. Right now it looks like it's just like a circle on the ground. But it presents more interesting shadows because it's actually a 3D object, and the shadows are reacting to the actual geometry of the 3D object. That's where it becomes a real balancing act, because at the end of the day, if I didn't put that ground there, the shadows from the table and chairs, they're just falling on a flat surface, right? Another thing that you could do in this specific scenario here, what if you actually modeled the dirt, the geometry of the dirt with like nooks and crannies and low points and high points, and you use that as the floor instead of a flat plane? That could work. I'm actually curious. Oh, maybe we'll try this. I'm freestyling now. I'm getting myself in trouble. What if we... What if I replaced the floor mesh with the ground mesh? Hide the floor mesh. And I scale this floor way up. Well, not that up. This is scaling vertically too. Uh-oh. Let's scale that back down. I was going to wonder what would happen if I put my white material on it. And I imagine it's not going to be perfect because it's going to catch weird shadows and it might be too dark. But it might be an interesting thing to try. Let's see. If I put my, what was that called? Floor, I think it was. Floor material. Yeah, floor. It's actually getting shadows from itself now. So you could probably turn off cast shadow on it. Yeah, this is bonus stuff right now. We already did the shadow. I'm just messing around a little bit. What if I turned off the shadow on the actual ground itself so it's not casting a shadow? Still like the ambient occlusion though. Maybe not. Yeah, I don't think that's going to work. Never mind. I need to rethink that. But I just wanted to tell you that about problems that can pop up because again, we're projecting shadows from 3D elements onto a 2D surface that in the real world is not actually flat. The ground has height to it, right? And it's your job as a compositor, or the compositor's job. This is why everybody has a specialized role in 3D, because every role is so fucking hard. To do everything is madness, right? This is your job as the compositor to marry those things together. Remember weeks ago, or maybe 2 weeks ago, I had that chart that showed 2D, 3D, and match motion was in the middle. The match motion artist lives in between the 2D and 3D worlds. And after you go through the entire 3D pipeline with the shadows and everything, it comes back to the 2D side, to the compositor. And it's the compositor's job to hate everybody else involved with the process because they're making life difficult for them probably. And their job to marry all this stuff back together and make it look good. Without seams, without edges, to make it look the best that it can look. With masking and all sorts of tedious rotoscoping and stuff. Those are problems that you're going to run into, and really they're just project-based problems, and we'll have to take them on one at a time. I mean, I can only show you so many examples, and that even then that wouldn't be enough. But does this, I know it's a lot again, but does this pipeline make sense? You have the tutorial now, you have the slides. Pretty straightforward. Yes. Well, we got shadows. Okay. Well, why don't we take a break and then we'll look at rendering it out, and compositing it in After Effects. Okay? All right. See you in 20 minutes. I just feel like I work myself into such a frenzy talking about this stuff. I'm like frothing at the mouth right now. And there's a shadow!
Are you ready for the summit?
Man, the last couple of days, there's so much stuff has come up that I don't know if I'm going to do it. I mean, I'm going to sit in the... I'm not going to leave the room.
Yeah.
But I don't know how active I'm going to be, unfortunately. There's just all these treatments that we have to make for these big projects. I don't know.
It
We'll
seems
see.
to be the case for a lot of people I know in that it's a busy time of the year. You know?
100%. I don't feel so bad, though, because there are like 60 people in the Slack chat.
Yeah.
I thought it was going to be much more intimate, so I don't feel so bad anymore.
Throw everybody in there.
Yeah. So I'm going to just be like a fly on the wall.
I don't even know how interactive it's going to be, though. You know?
Because there's so many people, right?
Yeah. I figured it was just going to be like a lectures. Almost.
The schedule has lots of
Interactivity.
Q&A and happy hour time. It seems like the lectures end at 3 every day.
And 3 to 6 is just like
QA and
this chat.
says literally happy hour
Okay.
is what it says.
Online?
Yeah, I suppose.
It might just be like a big Zoom room.
I think it is. Which, you know, the loudest people will suck all the oxygen out of the room.
Yeah.
We'll see.
We'll see.
They would build out and they make these giant characters and you strap on your back. And you like run through the room, experience it, where you ever and it's all not that because
I think I know what you're talking about. They were trying, it's like it was getting started, but then it got so hard.
yeah, so like they have a few like 4 or 5 experiences. I did one in Orlando.
All right, everybody, we're going to look at exporting now. Hopefully have a little bit of time at the end for some workshopping. So I brought back a more complicated scene we were working on last week. Just to show you it doesn't just work with tables and chairs. So similar sort of thing. We have shadows. You know, the shadows over here can start to be problematic because, you know, why that looks kind of weird just laying on top of the plants like that. If this was me and I was rendering this out, I would probably just mask that part of the shadow off and call it a day. I don't need to shadow those plants. Nobody going to notice. But those are the decisions that, you know, you will have to make when compositing. Also, you might notice that there's a little bit of a slice that's going through here right now. The reason for that is because that's the end of our plane. If I can show. It's actually the edge of our plane. So one way I could, if that is a problem, not that I think it's really a problem in this case at all, but if that is ever a problem, you can usually mess around with that by tweaking the skylight, brightening it up a little bit. What that really is that the ground is not pure white, so it's shadowing a little bit. So if you brighten things up a little bit, you can see that that disappeared. You know, this is a case where if I brighten it up, I clean up the shadow, but then maybe I'm not happy with the graphics anymore. It's a give and take, but remember, you can render out the shadow, and then you can go back and change the lighting and render out the other stuff. You think of doing things in passes, in steps, in stages, in layers. Don't think of doing everything all in one go. Okay, think of doing it in layers and steps. Any questions before I get started with the rendering? To composite it? Yeah. Yeah, I wanted to show Resolve 2 sometime in the semester, but today I just don't have enough time. Unless nobody cares, then I won't show. That's why I'm here. Yeah, not today. We'll start with something easy. Saying After Effects compositing is easy, but easier than a new program at you. So I didn't cheat, but there's this arch here, and I modified it so that the arch didn't actually cut through her body, so I didn't have to deal with that shadow right now. I spun the arch, I duplicated the arch, and I spun it the other way, so I didn't have to deal with it crossing over her chest. But like we talked about before, that's something that you could just put like a black solid on top of her, do a track matte so it's just on her body, and then just blur it. And if it's vaguely in the area of her chest where that shadow should be, most people won't even notice. That's a problem. Remember, compositing is smoke and mirrors. What is it? Industrial Light and Magic is their name, right? It's light and magic. It's trickery. As long as it gets the job done, it doesn't have to be perfect. All right, so we want to composite some stuff out. We want to composite out all of the Unreal actors with the shadows. So I want to composite out this stuff on transparency. And there are shadows there. They're just really washed out right now because it's on white. When it's on not white, they look like this. So they are there. And then we want to composite out the foreground by itself because, one, that's nice to have. You don't necessarily have to composite out the foreground too. I like to do it just because I like to have the foreground without the shadows attached to it. Because again, that's going to give me control to do things to these elements separately from the shadows. If I had the shadows still attached to this, then any changes that I made to, say, one of these surfaces, I'd have to mask out the shadows, which would be a pain in the butt. So we're going to render out all of those things. What I'm not rendering out is, I could render out the media too, but honestly, since we're compositing it in another program, there's no reason to render out the media from Unreal. We already have the media in its full resolution glory, so we're just going to import that into After Effects from its original source. Another important thing to consider here is your resolution of your footage. If your original footage was 4K and you rendered it down smaller because your computer's not very good and you didn't want Unreal to crash, etc., etc., maybe you rendered that down to 720p or 1080p. You want to render out your assets, your CG assets from Unreal at the resolution that you're compositing them into, right? So if we're compositing them into 4K footage in After Effects, we want to render them out as 4K assets from Unreal. Otherwise, they're going to be teeny tiny, and you'll have to blow them up, and they won't look as good. All right, so rendering out is really straightforward with with the old renderer, which is what I'm going to be showing you today. So I'm going to drag the element that I want to render from the composure window into sequencer. I'm going to render the shadows first. So all I did was drag it in here. You can render multiples out, but until you get comfortable with that, I don't recommend doing that because it can be really confusing which one is which. I like to render them out individually and put them into individual folders. That's just me. If you like to live life on the edge, go for it. But for right now, I'm just dropping shadows in here. And when we render, I think what we've used before was the movie render queue. I'm going to click the little dots next to here. Again, just doing this because it's more straightforward for right now. Click the little dots and click on Movie Scene Capture Legacy. This is the old renderer. Still works absolutely fine. After you set that, you can click the little board and it will pop up this window. You may have seen this before. We want to select Composure Export, which I've done. This is also where you would assign your resolution that's rendering out. My footage here, the original resolution was, I think, 2.5K, but I don't actually have that footage. I only have the 1080p footage with me right now. So that's what I will be rendering out. This file name format here, this is where you could specify, I forget the nomenclature for, I think it's period bracket CG element. Then it would actually do the world name, the CG element name, and then the frame name. If you could figure that out, then you could render it all into one folder and they would all have separate names. But I don't remember that off the top of my head. I'm going to set my output directory. What do I call this? I just call this shadow. Looks like I've already done this, so shadow 3. And click capture. Save it, always wants to save. Save. Let it do its thing. Now this is rendering out EXR files. EXR files, talked about before, they were created by ILM. They are used in VFX a lot. They're great files. They actually can support layers as well. In a future class, I'll give you a little sample of EXRs with layers and object IDs and all that fun stuff. But honestly, that's more than you need to know for the final project. So that will be just kind of a show and tell thing. So after that renders out, I'm going to go and import it. So I'm in After Effects. All right, EXR files are pretty big. I think each one of these is 16 megabytes. So have some space, because we'll be rendering this out probably a minimum of 2 times, maybe 3 or 4 times if you have something really complicated. So, if you have just your shadow export is, I don't know, a gigabyte, that becomes like a 4 gigabyte thing after you render out all of your different passes. All right, so here we go. This is our content, and like I said, the shadows are there. It's just that it's really bright floor right now, so you can't really see it. You will see it when we put it on top of the footage, though. I can go ahead and do that. Actually, wow, look at that. This render is actually 3.8 gigabytes. Time to get yourself a new hard drive for Thanksgiving. Black Friday. Yeah. You're getting a new hard drive, and you're getting a new hard drive. All right, I'm going to go and get my original footage. Or not the original, but the only footage I have on here. Drop this baby down here. I'm going to rename this to shadow with actors, I guess. So I want to show you a couple different scenarios. So shadows with actors. And if I change the blend mode to multiply, looks like this now. I have shadows, but I also have everything else looking very dark. Actually, the shadows themselves are incredibly light. So I'm going to go ahead and put a levels on this. Actually, did I render out the wrong one? I messed something up. I rendered out shadows. Good. Ruh-roh. Yeah, no shadows here. Just the actors. I don't want to crank it that much. Well, let's see if it resolves itself by rendering out the foreground. So I rendered out the shadows layer. Let's try rendering out the foreground layer. Drag the foreground in. Remember, the foreground is just the assets by itself. Always wants to save, save, save. Let that render. File. Oops. So here's the foreground by itself now. If I rename this foreground by itself on alpha too. Another point that I should make here. Notice that there's a shadow on this piece of dirt right here. There's also a shadow that's going to be falling through this transparency onto the video. If you crank the shadow on the video, it's going to start to not match up with the shadow on the ground, right? So keep stuff like that in mind. Remember, you can always re-render. You can always mask things out. So now if I bring the foreground in here, still don't have my shadows, but we'll figure that out next. I'll try rendering it again. Strange. So as of now, I deleted my shadow layer. I just have my foreground, right? All synced up, just like it was before. So prior to today, where we talked about shadows, you'd be done, right? If you wanted to put something behind her, maybe you have a different CG element that's called background, BG. You bring that one in too as a separate element. And then you rotoscope her on top of that. You could do that. Let's try to troubleshoot the shadow problem now. So shadows are obviously here. The shadow didn't change anything. So it's pretty much what you see is what you get. Move the foregrounds. Put the shadows in here. Let's try this again. Usually this re-rendering never works. It never solves the problem, but I'm not really sure what the problem is, so we're going to give it a shot. Did Unreal really just decide not to include the shadow when I clicked render? I doubt it. It's probably me that is the idiot, but don't want to admit that. So let's see. Import file, shadow. Still not looking very shadowy, folks. Literally just did this 5 minutes before class. But there's no shadow. You know, it's good I'm having these problems because you'll have these problems too. Maybe this is all just an act. I'm setting up failure and then I'm going to be like, Eureka. Or maybe I'm really in a panic right now. Shadows. Shadows is in sequencer, which is supposed to be. The only thing that I could think that got messed up. Let's close down all these other windows. No shadows is off. Material is fine. Because if it was a pipeline issue, it wouldn't show up here. So it seems to be like it's just not rendering out the right thing. It's like it's only rendering out the foreground elements. The only other thing I could think of is, you know, when I adjusted that skylight, I might have brightened it up too much to get rid of the background. So if I lower this down, I'm going to reveal the background scene now, but that's not a big deal. I can easily mask that out. Now let's try rendering this out. So it could be that the shadow is just too washed out. Let's try it. And that's exactly what the problem was. Just like I knew it was. No, actually I didn't know. I was just trying to think of changes that we had made. So there just wasn't enough shadow information apparently in the footage to render out, I guess. I guess we washed it out too much with the skylight. So going back to the composition, you know, I have my foreground and I have my video plates. Now I can put my shadows in here. I'll call this image sequence shadows. Put it between the foreground and the media. I'm actually going to rename this to media. So looking at this now, foreground, shadows, media. Foreground sits on top of the shadows, sits on top of the media. So the foreground is just this. The shadow layer is all of the cemetery stuff and the shadow and the white background. And obviously the media is the media. So if I go to the shadows layer and I set the blend mode to multiply, now we have the shadow on top of the background. If I take off the foreground, we're going to get sort of what we had before, you know, this ghostly image, which is actually kind of cool. It's just a shadowed image of all of the assets as well, which is why we cover these back up with the foreground assets without the shadows, so we don't have those. And it's at that point Your mission accomplished. We have shadows. We brought it over into After Effects. We fully composited it, fully camera tracked it, made a spooky little scene. Congratulations. Now you could do any sort of coloring that you would want to do. I would go over here maybe and mask out that shadow with like a rough mask on those plants. I could go on the shadow layer itself and put like a levels or a curves on here, and mess around with the density of this shadow. We are blending the shadow of that dirt pile right there with the actual shadow that's laying on top of the video. So, you got to balance that line. Another thing that you could do is, this gets a little bit problematic, but if you wanted to blur that, you could blur the edge of the shadow. The problem is that blur starts to affect all the other assets, because it's not just blurring the shadows, it's actually blurring all these things, right? So what could we do to make that work? We could take a matte to knock out the cemetery assets, so we literally just have the shadows. Could do that. Anybody have any thoughts how we could make a matte just of the cemetery objects right now? What would be a brute force way to do that just in After Effects? Well, we have this stuff. We already kind of have a matte of it, right? So what if I used this as a tracking matte for shadows? But I guess I want the opposite, right? So that just gives me the shadows. Check that out. That's pretty cool. So everybody understand what I did there? I used the foreground matte, which had an alpha, which was just this stuff. And I used it as what's called a tracking matte in After Effects, basically matting out using this alpha, and then I inverse the matte. So everything that is alpha right now is retained in the shadows in here. So everything that was an alpha and the other thing is now not an alpha. So now I just have the shadows. Also have all this white, which is mildly annoying, but still works. But now I could probably blur it without a problem. Maybe. Not exactly. I would need to get rid of that white. But all sorts of things that we can do, though. Let's talk about that problem with the plants. This is a very specific problems. Every project is going to have its own unique problems to deal with. So this layer right here happens to be the problem with the shadows. What if I just put a mask on the shadows and I removed that with a subtractive mask, and then I softened it a little bit, and I would probably want to animate it as well because the footage moves. I only would need to animate it for a couple frames. It's only a problem in like from here to the end. So move it there. Doesn't even need to be that pretty, to be honest. Something like that organic shape of those plants, you can get away with a lot of problems. Is anybody going to notice a shadow on those? Probably not. You guys all will, because you want to be mean to me, but there we go. Or you could track an object on here, and then parent the mask to it. Be good to do too. That's something that Resolve excels at a lot better than After Effects, tracking things really quickly, parenting masks to the tracked positions in Resolve. But the point is that that shadow's no longer a problem. Should do a better job, but good enough for now. So these are the sorts of things that you're going to have problems with. You have to clean up shadows that are problematic. Maybe you want to soften it. Maybe you want to darken a certain area. Maybe you want to put the foreground in front of a person. You want to put something behind a person. You need to rotoscope them out. See, in this case, this grass is actually on top of her. So what would I do here? Luckily, I already rotoed her out. As a Luma mat. So here I'm using the Luma mat, and then I'm going to assign that footage that I currently have selected. I'm going to go to track mat that's currently set to none. I'm going to tell it to use the Luma mat on the layer above it, which is just by clicking this. And just that makes her on top of it right there. Now this is a problem because what looks good at this frame becomes a problem when that tombstone in the foreground slides in front of her. Dun dun dun. So this is where you got to have more of a plan. Mask that looks good at frames 1, 2, and 3 might not look good at frames 4, 5, and 6. And that's where the tedious work comes in. And that's not an Unreal thing. That's not a Cinema 4D thing. That's just a compositing thing. It's just a life thing. That's what you signed up for when you took this class. That's the real work. But it doesn't involve composure anymore. You just have to drag masks around. So what I would do in that case, maybe I would turn the foreground layer off when the tombstone goes in front of it. Maybe I would have another thing I could really easily do, actually, that makes sense, is this is where things get really wild. You want to start having a lot of layers. Let's have another foreground here, and I'll call this, foreground tombstone. And I will mask this out. This only becomes difficult to do when the grass starts to go around it. Otherwise, it's pretty simple to do. And I'm just doing a rush job. I don't really even need to be that precise once this mask starts to go away. Actually, the layer can just end, to be honest. Because I only need it when it's in front of her. Right? Yeah, you get the idea. This is very tedious work that takes time to do. I'm not going to bore you with the step-by-step process here. If you've done After Effects before, you should be familiar with this sort of stuff. Obviously, the problem comes back because I stopped doing the mask. But this is what has to be done if you're trying to do a fully composited project. It's not just done when it comes out of Unreal, usually. Unless you're strategic, point your shadows the other way. Don't make anything in front of your subject. Don't put anything behind anybody. Have them stay perfectly still. Then it's easier. But not as fun. More boring, right? Any questions about that? Like I said, it's really kind of a composite by composite problem solving. But you just render out really two layers from composure, the shadows and the foreground, and comp them together in After Effects with your media. And when you do that, you're most of the way there. It's that last 10% that is the difficult part with the compositing and the masking, if need be. Other interesting things here with composure. I'm not sure how necessary these are, but you know how we added compositing elements or layer elements before by right-clicking layer element, and we did the CG elements. There also are CG mats. And we kind of made our own mat in After Effects by using the alpha mat from the foreground. But if you want to create dedicated mats in Composure, you can, rather to render out or do something live. It's like this mat element. Then it asks me, what do I want to do? What type of mat is it? Is it a positive or negative mask? A holdout mat or a different type of mat? Which capture actors do I want to include in the mat? This might seem confusing, but it's actually very straightforward. I'm literally just telling it to include the furniture, or not the furniture, but the tombstones, and it just makes a mask for me. And then I can render this out the same way that I rendered all the other things out. Drag it into Sequencer, render it out. You don't want negative on the tombstones, you change the mat type from holdout to garbage mat. Or you could just invert it in After Effects. So other ways to create mats. When I think about this, you could have every single tombstone there in that cemetery on its own CG element, so that you can composite it as, instead of two pieces, the shadows and the foreground, you could have each one have its own shadow and its own foreground, meaning that you can completely control them individually. And this is where this workflow starts to break down, and you want to move into the movie render queue with object IDs and this thing called CryptoMat. You should really learn Nuke then, all that sort of stuff. But we're not going there right now. Let me show you another really complicated scene. That's a Gengar. So this was a pretty complicated project that I've shown you all before. Do a 360 on the tower, the Wizard's Tower, right? This was rendered out straight from Unreal with just the video playing on a plane in Unreal, which is not colored appropriately. I don't have individual control of all the different assets. It's not the high resolution footage. Sucks because look at this and I'm like, shit, man, I'm 90% of the way there. Now you're telling me I got to do all this compositing stuff for 20 hours to get the last 10%? Yeah, that's exactly what I'm telling you. So all this stuff got rendered out as tons and tons and tons of little pieces. Her by herself. Green screen. The castle with the effects by itself, with the sky, without her. The castle foreground matted out with the effects. But just the effects affecting the surfaces, and in the foreground, not the stuff that is being shot off. Or I guess some of the stuff that's being shot off. Then here's the full mat of the castle to be able to separate out the pieces. Here's another castle mat. This was a very difficult composite. This is the the foreground of the castle mat because you want to place her in the middle of the castle tower. So this was kind of just a hack to do. I just put a black plane in the middle of the castle where she was, just to bisect the castle top, and then just drop this on top of her. So what, you're telling me you really want to go in, you want to rotoscope out each of those little castle things as it goes by her? No, that's madness. This is where mats can really help you. It may seem like a lot more work, but sometimes it's not. Otherwise, that work would be in rotoscoping. Here's a render of EXRs that's just these big flashes in the foreground from Unreal. Why do all these things separately? So you have individual control of them, right? You want to change the color, you want to blur them, you want to do all sorts of other sort of stuff to them. And most of all this content, like this was just the flashes. Now here's the matte for the flashes. The black and white matte that tells it where the image is on and where it's off at. Here is the effects. All the different magic stuff that's happening. This is playing from a remote computer, so it's kind of laggy. This is not on alpha, so it needs a matte as well. A Luma matte. Oh no. Yeah, where's the Luma? There's the Luma matte for. Don't know what that error is. Cannot read. Cannot read. Oh no. More effects. The sky by itself. Is this overboard? No, it wasn't. I needed all this stuff. Maybe I could get rid of like 2 of these things. I might have been a little overboard. But all these different layers were needed to have individual control. Go to... Remember we looked at this. Where's that at? It's that picture that showed the graphics separated out. I can't be able to find it. Oh well. We needed all those layers to be able to have individual control. And this is the last one. This was also a hack. This was just to be able to, all that camera movement, right? But how do I stick the original video to the top of the castle, right? I'm not doing that in Unreal because I took her away from the plane, because that doesn't give me the video footage that I want. So what I did was I replaced her with a plane that had 2 white dots on it. And I'm doing object tracking in After Effects to track those 2 white dots to give me the scale and the position of the layer of her. So she scales appropriately and moves appropriately as the camera moves in After Effects. Wild shit. A lot of work. More than you need to know. But not any of this stuff is not out of the realm of what you might need to do for your final project. I'm not saying that it's going to go to this extent, but this would be an extreme example of going crazy with compositing. I will say that in Unreal and composure with effects, Niagara effects or cascade effects, fire, explosions, that sort of stuff, sometimes they don't come out from composure well. We briefly talked about this in a past class. I forget the context. We talk about this in an upcoming class a little bit too. But remember, there's all of these different view modes you can render out to be able to create different mats. That's actually how I created different mats for like the effects here. Oops. I'm rendering out like the transparency mat to get, let's find one that's a little bit more interesting. Yeah. The transparency mat to get this blob, explosion blob magic thing out. What frame is this? 1614? Yeah. So that mat is masking out this thing. So if you have problems getting out effects, we can talk about it and talk about best practices for rendering out those sorts of things. Any sort of effect, or really not even effect, anything that has translucency is difficult to render out from Composure. It's funny because things like that render out fantastic from the movie render queue when you're not using Composure. So there's a weird disconnect between Composure and the newer type of rendering in Unreal, which is unfortunate, but hopefully they fix it at some point. But we got shadows, so that's cool. So I just want to show you something. This is pretty straightforward, I think, this project here. So a couple things in the foreground. There's not even a background and a shadow. I think this is probably about, assuming that you're doing real world footage and not green screen, this is about as simple as it would get. And this is probably like my expectation for what projects are going to have. If you're doing green screen, then a lot of these problems go away and you have your own set of problems dealing with shadows and stuff. The example with the fireworks and stuff, that was just an extreme example to show you the power of what you could do with enough time and willpower. Questions? I'm just all blown away. Yeah.
I'm sorry if I missed it. Can you go over? Are you planning on talking about the movie render queue next week?
Not next week because we're going to gear up for our final projects, but I mean it's not a requirement for what we need to do. It's okay. More like a nice to have, and it doesn't play great with Composure. So you kind of have to set up your stuff in Composure, and then almost rip it apart to get it to work.
So there's no easy way to get like different passes out of your Unreal scene?
Not with the current Composure pipeline that we learned. If you use the Off-World Live thing, it becomes easier. But we got to learn that. Which has its own sort of quirks. And all of these pipelines are very quirky. You definitely can get render layers out of the movie render queue. It's just, it doesn't play nice with Composure. Like, fine, I'll just show you something, all right? What do I want to do? Oh, I'll start a new level. Undo all my hard work that I just did for Derek's sake. So let's say I had, and I will do this again in a little bit more of a formal fashion, but just to appease an appetite here. So I'm happy to. So what do I want to do? All right, cube, cool, right? So if I was to take this cube and I put it on a new layer called cube, now it's on a layer by itself, right? Fancy. If I was to go into, let's create a quick level sequence. Let's create a quick camera. Very cool. Keyframe there. Let's pull this out. If anybody wants to try to find a better pipeline with the movie render queue, that would be awesome. But last time I looked, it wasn't really feasible. Amazing shot here, right? Love it. I call it cube. Okay. So now if I go to the movie render queue, this thing pops up this scary looking window. Just going to kind of rifle through these settings real quick. Change this to EXR. This is really not the important part. Rendering this out using EXR. If I click on deferred rendering, there's these things right here, stencil layers. Stencil layer is where I can apply a layer to be separated out by itself. The layer I called cube, it's just going to be the cube, right? Also can include the default layer. The default layer is everything that has not been assigned into a layer. So in this case, the floor, no, I'm not sure if it will do the sky or not, but we'll see. Click accept. Good, good, good. Where's this rendering to? Output. Folder. What? What more jobs have the unsaved map wizard? Oh, okay. Gotta save your stuff, folks. Test. Why it makes me save twice. Save again? Come on. Okay, render. What? This wants me to save. Okay, I'll call it test 2 then. Fine. Fine, I'll call you test 3. All right, let's see if this works. It's always something, right? So it renders our camera like we would expect, right? I'm not sure if I have OpenEXR installed in After Effects, so it might not work in After Effects, but I'm pretty sure I can show you in Photoshop. Because I was not prepared. Oh, it also rendered out JPEGs, I guess, because I had JPEG checked. Anyways, EXRs. So here, if we look at it in After Effects, it's not going to be separated out because I don't have the EXR plugin installed yet, but I think I do have it installed in Photoshop. So if I open it up here, this is not a built-in Photoshop thing. This is a third-party plugin called EXR.io. This allows a program to extract object IDs and layer information from EXRs. So if I open this now, I should get a bunch of cool stuff. Check this out. That's just the cube by itself. That's the matte of the background by itself. That's everything by itself. There's a lot of possibilities with something like this. And this is much more of a professional, traditional VFX compositing pipeline where you have these sorts of mattes, especially using EXRs that can hold multiple layers. But this is newish in Unreal. And this part doesn't play well with composure, unfortunately.
What might happen?
What might happen?
Yeah.
It'll explode. It just won't render. just won't render.
The demonstrate default layer will it just render the queue route?
Mm-hmm.
But like as the EX starts something to like
It would just be this.
okay.
Yeah. Yeah, it would just be that. There is a really great, and this is kind of getting into the weeds a little bit. There's a really great video on this. Here, this is not the video that I wanted, but this is a video that walks through this process. There's a better video, I'm not sure if I linked it, that Epic had. No, I don't know. I can't find it. But that works really well for doing transparency too, which is pretty cool. But doesn't really play very well with composure. Now, what we can do to possibly make it work is after I destroyed all my composure stuff. But if we stripped all that away, then it's not really a composure project anymore. It's just a bunch of assets, right? So it should just work. But that's another step. We can talk about that in the future. But the movie render queue is pretty cool. Other questions? Are you all ready to start coming up with ideas for final projects? Yeah? Sure seems like it. Start thinking about it. Next week we'll talk a little bit more in detail about it. We will. I don't know. Has everybody already seen the videos from last year that I posted? Okay, so maybe we don't have to look at them again. Maybe we will just really quick. But I'll just talk about like making your proposal that's due the following week. So in 2 weeks, 2 weeks from today, you will be presenting with your finals group a presentation of what you're going to be doing for your final project. 2 weeks. Pretty soon. Are you ready? Are you ready? Are you ready? Are you ready? Doesn't seem like it. So if you want to start shopping for partners now, that's absolutely fine. I don't really have any guidelines other than I think any group over 3 people is a bit unnecessary, unless you can tell me otherwise. I mean, if this is like a monumental project with insane amount of moving parts, then we can talk about it. But I think that gets a little bit big. Do you have to work in a group? No. I would like you to work in a group because interacting with humans is something that you're going to do for the rest of your life, but you don't have to. Okay. We'll talk more about guidelines next week.